2:15 in the afternoon. Central Avenue was sweltering, heat rising in waves from the asphalt. Inside his patrol car, Officer Travis Reed loosened the collar of his uniform, the sweat-soaked fabric sticking to the back of his neck. The radio crackled with a report of a stolen vehicle 4 blocks away. His index finger tapped a steady rhythm on the leather holster at his hip. It was the 10th hour of his shift. On the opposite sidewalk, a black man was walking. Reed squinted. Under the harsh Phoenix sun, everything reflected a blinding white light. The man wore a light blue shirt, walking slowly, his head tilted slightly. What caught Reed's eye was the long, white object with a metal-capped tip, sweeping back and forth across the ground. In Reed's mind, a process automatically kicked in. Identify subject. Analyze threat. Make decision. The first mistake was in the analysis. Reed didn't see a blind man's cane. He saw an iron bar, or some kind of crude, disguised weapon. The cost of mistaking a medical device for a threat was, for now, still within the city's budget, $180,000, and a termination notice to be signed in 6 weeks. Reed had a small scar on his chin from a bicycle fall last year. His personnel file contained 2 complaints for unrestrained conduct. Reed turned the wheel, pulling the patrol car to the curb. The tires crunched dryly on loose gravel. He got out. The car door slammed shut, the bang echoing in the silence. Liam Miller stopped. He couldn't see the police car, but his ears picked up the sound of an idling engine and heavy footsteps coming toward him. Liam tightened his grip slightly on the handle of his aluminum cane. "Stop. Drop the weapon," Reed said. His voice was thick, devoid of any courtesy. Liam turned toward the voice. "What weapon?" "This is my cane. I'm blind." Reed stood 15 feet away, his hand on the butt of his gun. "Don't play games with me. I know what a club looks like. Put your hands where I can see them. Now." Liam's face was still. He pressed his lips together. The muscles in his neck tensed slightly. "Officer, this is a white cane. It has red reflective tape at the bottom. It's for the visually impaired. And you expect me to believe that?" Reed took 2 more steps. The heels of his boots made a dry sound on the pavement. Reed maintained his ready stance, ignoring the medical label on the cane's shaft. He didn't look up at the 2nd-floor window of the office building across the street, where a passerby was pointing a phone camera at him. Liam kept the cane upright. "I'm on my way to the Copper Star coffee shop. I walk this way every week. I don't care where you're going." Reed cut him off. "Turn around. Get against the wall." Silence. The wind whistled softly between the tall buildings. Liam didn't move right away. If he let go of the cane, he would lose his only point of reference for navigating the 13-foot-wide sidewalk. "I need the cane for balance," Liam said, his voice low and steady. "I'll say it one last time. Drop that thing, or I will use force." Reed growled. His nostrils flared. Sweat ran into his eyes, making them sting slightly. Liam let out a long breath through his nose. He slowly turned, his hand never leaving the cold aluminum handle of the cane. The procedure was hitting a dead end. The brick wall of the department store behind Liam was rough and cool. He backed up until his shoulder blades were flat against the hard surface. In front of him, the radio on Reed's shoulder squawked out a series of disjointed code numbers. Reed moved closer. Liam could smell stale coffee and the strong scent of fabric softener on the officer's uniform. Reed looked down at Liam's hand. The white aluminum cane was still held tight. Its tip touched the toe of Reed's shiny black boot. "I told you to drop this," Reed said. His voice was low, vibrating in his chest. Liam didn't let go. He twisted his wrist slightly, trying to pull the tip of the cane back toward him to avoid contact. But Reed was faster. The officer brought his foot up and stomped his heavy boot down on the aluminum shaft near the ground. A dry metallic clang echoed on the concrete. Liam felt a sharp jolt travel from the cane's tip all the way to his shoulder. He staggered, pressing one hand against the brick wall to keep his balance. The cane was now pinned firmly under Reed's boot. "Officer, you're standing on my eyes," Liam said. His voice wasn't loud. Each word spoken slowly. Reed didn't move his foot right away. He stood still, his weight pressing down on the cane. His gaze swept over the part of the shaft with a blue label from the medical equipment manufacturer. The word Ambutek and the symbol of a person in a wheelchair were clearly visible in the sunlight. Reed saw it. There was a delay in his movement. Reed's pupils contracted. But instead of lifting his foot, he narrowed his eyes at Liam's impassive face behind the sunglasses. "Don't use that tone with me. This thing could crack a man's skull if you swung it hard enough," Reed replied. He eased the pressure on his foot, but then immediately kicked the cane with the toe of his boot, sending it skittering out of Liam's reach. The cane clattered as it rolled across the sidewalk before stopping near the curb. Just then, a teenager in a baggy t-shirt, holding a phone, stopped about 10 feet away. The phone's camera was pointed directly at Reed. A few office workers coming out of the lobby of the opposite building also paused. They didn't say anything, just stood in a scattered arc. Reed noticed the phones. A vein in his neck twitched. Instead of stepping back to reassess the situation, Reed moved forward, pressing his chest against Liam's shoulder, pinning him tighter to the wall. "Turn around. Interlace your fingers behind your head," Reed ordered. Liam moved slowly. He brought his hands up, lacing his fingers together. Without his cane, his body listed slightly to the left. Reed roughly spun Liam around and shoved his face against the coarse brick. The friction of the brick against his skin made Liam wince, but he didn't make a sound. Reed began to search him. He shoved a hand into Liam's pants pocket and pulled out a leather wallet and a smartphone. Reed flipped open the wallet. Inside was an Arizona state ID and an old coffee receipt. In the corner of the ID card, the symbol for a blind person was embossed. Reed ran his thumb over it. There was a pause in the officer's movements. He looked at the card, then at the man he had pressed against the wall, and then out at the growing crowd of people filming. "This is a fake, right?" Reed asked. His voice had lost its earlier certainty. It had a slight waver to it, like footsteps on sinking sand. Liam answered, his lips touching the brick. "You can run the number on your radio. I have no reason to fake a disability." Reed didn't use his radio right away. He shoved the wallet into his own pocket. A woman in the crowd took a step forward, her voice cutting through the thick tension. "Hey, officer. He's a regular at the coffee shop on the corner. He really is blind." Reed turned his head, his eyes landing on the woman. He didn't answer her. Reed was stuck in a procedure of his own making, admitting a mistake now, in front of 5 phone cameras, was like tearing off his own uniform. He took a deep breath, the smell of sweat and hot asphalt filling his nostrils. Reed grabbed Liam by the collar and yanked him away from the wall. "We'll see what this card is worth in the system," Reed said. Officer Reed stood a couple feet from Liam. He reached up, grasped the butt of his gun, then let go, then reached again to adjust the heavy leather belt laden with gear. The metal clips on his keychain jingled steadily. Reed held Liam's ID card with 2 fingers, bringing it close to his face, squinting at the embossed ID number. "You said it was B1234. What was the rest?" Reed asked, dragging out the words, deliberately pausing. Liam stood leaning slightly against the wall, his hands still laced behind his head. His knuckles were white from clenching them so tightly. "B1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Officer, it's right under my picture." Reed didn't look where Liam indicated. He turned the card over, looked at the back, then flipped it to the front again. "I'm the one doing the reading here. You understand. I don't need you to teach me how to read an ID. This number, these symbols. Who knows if you guys printed this yourselves or if the state issued it." As he spoke, Reed sidestepped, bumping his shoulder against Liam's, a deliberate move to claim the space. Across the street, the crowd had grown to about 10 people. The murmuring started to get louder. Reed reached up and pressed the button on the radio attached to his shoulder. The static crackle of the radio waves cut through the sweltering air. Dispatch. This is Unit 4. 1, 2. I need a check on a subject. Names, Liam Miller. Date of birth, May 12th, 1992. ID number B, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Reed let his hand off the radio button, but he kept it resting there. He looked down at his shoes, then over at the white cane lying near the gutter. Reed licked his lips and turned back to Liam. You know, you carrying this thing around on the street. It gives people the wrong idea. The law's the law. I have the right to inspect any object that could potentially cause harm. You understand the word harm? Liam didn't turn his head. I understand. But it's a federally recognized medical assistive device. It's not a weapon unless you intentionally treat it as one. Reed let out a scoff. He adjusted his gloves, pulling the fabric tight over his knuckles. There you go again. You always use those technical terms to try and smooth things over. If I say it's suspicious, it's suspicious. On this sidewalk, right now, I'm the one who decides what's safe for the public. You stand still. Don't move a foot. The radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice came through, flat and emotionless. Unit 4, 1, 2. Liam Miller. Address 1247, North Central. Apartment 4B. Records clean. No warrants. No priors. Valid driver's license with a Class 1 visual impairment identifier. Reed was silent. His arm, which was resting on his belt, lowered slightly, but he immediately jutted his chin back up. Reed didn't look at the crowd, which was starting to murmur in protest. He stepped closer to Liam, so close that his breath, thick with the smell of cigarettes, washed over Liam's face. Listen here, Miller. Reed lowered his voice. Those codes just tell me you're in the system. They don't tell me what you might be hiding on you. Why are you cooperating so smoothly? Usually, people get scared. Or they argue. It's like you've got it rehearsed. Now that's what's suspicious. You know what I mean. Reed held up the ID card, tapping its plastic edge against Liam's shoulder. I can keep you here for another 2 hours to verify this blindness code with the medical authorities. You want to wait? Or do you want to admit that you're deliberately provoking an officer by carrying this pointed object on the street? Liam breathed slowly. His chest rose and fell under his blue shirt. I'm not provoking anyone. I'm going to get coffee. Coffee? Huh. Every Thursday afternoon. Right. It's a nice story, Reed said, loosening his belt again. But I don't like the way you're just standing here. I don't like the way this crowd is looking at me because of you. You're disturbing the public order. Miller, is that a problem for you? Because it's a real problem for me. Officer Reed held the plastic ID card, using his thumbnail to pick at the laminated corner. He looked at Liam's picture, then back at the dark sunglasses of the man standing before him. Reed didn't hand the card back right away. He turned it over between his fingers, the plastic making a rustling sound against his synthetic gloves. Miller. Right, Reed asked again, even though he'd just read the name over the radio less than a minute ago. Liam tilted his head back slightly, the nape of his neck brushing against the rough brick. Yes, Liam Miller. Reed stepped closer, the toe of his boot just inches from the tip of Liam's shoe. He held out his hand, but not to give back the ID. Reed held the card in one hand, while his other went up to adjust his own sunglasses, which were slipping from the sweat. I have a report here that you're causing a disturbance. You aware of that? Liam pressed his lips together. He didn't answer immediately. He raised his hand, as if to smooth the bunched-up fabric of his shirt on his shoulder, but then let it fall. What did you say? Liam asked again, his voice low and a bit hoarse. I said you're disrupting the flow of traffic on this sidewalk. Reed repeated, drawing out the last syllables. That cane. You're sweeping it too wide. People have to dodge you. That's obstruction of a public walkway. I can write you a ticket for that. Do you understand? Liam was silent. He tilted his head to one side, listening to a distant car horn. He held out his hand, palm open, to receive his ID. Reed didn't place the card in his palm. He simply let his fingers go, allowing the card to fall, hit Liam's chest, and then slide into the gap between his stomach and his waistband. Liam flinched, his hands fumbling at his waist to catch the card before it hit the ground. It took him a few seconds to find it. Then he used slightly trembling fingertips to shove it into his back pocket. He missed the opening once, the card hitting the seam before finally slipping inside. I understand, Liam said, after the card was safely put away. Can I go now? Reed didn't move out of the way. He stood still, looking down at the aluminum cane lying 6 feet away, near the edge of the gutter. I'll let you go, but this is a warning. An official warning. Liam stood his ground. A warning for what? For how you use that thing, Reed said, pointing down at the cane, though Liam couldn't see it. Next time I see you sweeping that thing into someone's legs, or making someone flinch, I'm bringing you down to the station to test your ability to control an assistive device. Do you hear me clearly? Liam didn't answer right away. He licked his dry lips. How are you telling me I should use my cane to avoid a warning? Reed narrowed his eyes. He reached out and patted Liam on the shoulder. A pat that wasn't hard, but was firm enough to make Liam step back slightly. It's not my job to teach you. My job is to ensure public safety. Go on. Now. But remember what I said. I'll be watching this street. Reed took a step back, his hand still on his belt, his thumb hooked into the pouch for his handcuffs. Liam didn't move right away. He bent down, one hand braced against the brick wall to orient himself, the other fumbling across the ground to find his cane. His hand swept over loose grit and the heat of the concrete. Reed stood there watching, not moving. It's about 3 feet to your left. A voice called out from the crowd. Liam turned toward the voice, sweeping his hand a few more times before it connected with the cool rubber handle of the cane. He gripped it tightly and stood up. The cane's aluminum shaft was now slightly bent where the sole of Reed's boot had pressed down on it. Liam ran his hand along the shaft, feeling the small dent in the metal. He didn't say anything, just let out a sharp breath. Go on, Reed said, his voice starting to sound impatient as he noticed the crowd's murmuring getting louder. Don't let me see you standing here for another minute. Liam folded the cane, but then immediately snapped it open again. A habitual motion to check the tension of the elastic cord inside. The aluminum sections clicked against each other. He took his first steps, slow and less certain than before. Reed watched him go, until Liam disappeared around the corner of the department store. The officer walked back to his patrol car and shut the door. He didn't look in his rearview mirror, where people were still holding up their phones, filming his back as he left. The bell on the door of the Copper Star coffee shop jingled softly as Liam pushed his way in. The blast of cold from the air conditioner hit his face, easing the sweltering heat of Central Avenue. Liam stopped right by the door, his left hand still clenching the handle of the slightly bent aluminum cane. He stood still, his chest heaving, across the street. The teenager in the baggy t-shirt was still standing in the same spot. He was looking at his phone screen, where the video he'd just finished shooting was on the playback screen. The image was shaky, but it clearly showed the black sole of Reed's boot stepping on the white aluminum tube. He slid his thumb toward the share button. His finger stopped, millimeters from the screen. He looked up, watched the patrol car start to pull away, then looked back down at the video. He stood there, lips pressed together, watching the word upload blink. It wasn't until the police car was completely gone, past the intersection, that he finally pressed his fingertip down hard. In the flower shop next door. Mrs. Gable stood behind the frosted glass. Her hand was still on the brass doorknob. She had seen Liam's hands fumbling on the hot ground, searching for the cane. She had been about to open the door, but then she froze when she saw Reed put his hand on the butt of his gun. She turned back inside, picked up the phone to call someone, but then set it down, not knowing what to say. She stood watching through a crack in the blinds, until there was nothing left but an empty sidewalk with dust motes floating in the sunlight. The incident didn't blow up immediately. It moved like an undercurrent. At the Phoenix Police Headquarters, a young officer named Harris sat in the monitoring room, his eyes fixed on a screen tracking local social media feeds. He saw a short clip pop up with the title, "Cop and a Blind Man on Central." Harris clicked the video. He saw Reed. He saw the white cane. Harris was about to hit the button to report it to his superiors, but his hand paused on the keyboard. He looked at the clock. There were 15 minutes left in his shift. Harris leaned back in his chair, watching the video play through a second time. He thought about how Reed had seniority. Harris closed the video tab and stood up to make a cup of coffee. The video continued to exist there, its view count quietly jumping from 20 to 500. At the coffee shop, Chloe, the barrister, put a black coffee on the table. She saw the dent in Liam's cane, which was leaning against the table leg. "What happened to your cane?" "Liam," Chloe asked, her hand wiping a water stain from the stone tabletop. Liam reached down, his hand touching the dent. "Just a little run-in on the street. It's nothing." Chloe stood there for a few more beats. She looked at Liam's sunglasses, then down at his hand, which was gripping the handle of the porcelain mug a little too tightly. She was about to ask more, to say that he didn't seem okay. But then a customer rang the bell at the counter. Chloe turned away, leaving Liam with his steaming coffee. By now, on social media, the first comments were starting to show up on the teenager's video. "Isn't that a blind person's cane? What's that officer's name? Why did he step on it?" The comments came in slowly, a few minutes apart. Nobody screamed right away. People watched. They thought about it. And then they typed. A freelance reporter for the local paper happened to scroll past the clip while he was waiting for a sandwich. He didn't call the newsroom immediately. He took a screenshot, double-checked the license plate on the patrol car that was barely visible in the clip. And then he started to write a short post, one by one, from the teenager on his phone, to the woman who owns the flower shop, to the Harris dispatcher, to Chloe, the barista. Every single one of them had a moment where they could have broken the chain. But hesitation, awkwardness, and the simple delays of everyday life let the whole thing keep rolling forward. By 6 in the evening, as the sun started to dip behind the high-rises, the video had hit 10,000 views. Officer Reed was sitting in a fast food joint, a burger in his hand, his eyes on a baseball game playing on the wall-mounted TV. He had no idea that thousands of people were starting to type the name Travis Reed into their search engines. Reed chewed slowly, raising a hand now and then to adjust his collar, which still smelled of sweat from the hot afternoon. He still figured it was just another routine shift with some pain-in-the-ass black guy. 8 o'clock the next morning. Police Chief Sarah Morgan's office was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and new paper. Sunlight cut through the blinds, laying long stripes across the wooden desk. Across from her, Lieutenant Miller, a man with salt and pepper hair and a habit of tapping his ballpoint pen on the table, was clicking open a file labeled BWC 412 Reed. The shaky footage from Reed's bodycam filled the screen. Start at the 2:18 mark. Morgan said. She didn't look at Miller. Her eyes were glued to the blurry movements on the screen. In the video, Reed's hand came into view as he reached up to adjust the camera lens, then lowered it to touch his holster. Reed's breathing came through the microphone, heavy and ragged. The image of Liam Miller appeared, standing still by a brick wall. "Stop it there," Morgan ordered. On the screen, Reed was holding Liam's ID card. His thumb rubbed back and forth over a corner of the card. There was a long silence. Reed didn't read the number on the card right away. He turned his head and looked at the crowd across the street, then looked down at his own shoes. A wasted motion. Only then did he bring the card up close to his eyes. "You see that?" Miller said, his pen stopping its tapping. Reed saw the symbol for the blind. He looked at it for 4 full breaths. But then, he asks, "Is this real or fake?" Morgan didn't answer. She reached for the paper file beside her and flipped to the initial incident report. In it, Reed had written in black ink. His handwriting slanted and rushed. Subject exhibiting uncooperative behavior. Concealing identity with questionable documentation. Miller. Hit play. The radio squawked. The dispatcher's voice clearly read out Liam's address and his status as visually impaired. In the video, Reed stood perfectly still after he heard it. He didn't take his hand off the radio right away. He keyed the mic. Didn't say anything. And then let go. Just write it that way. Should be fine. Reed mumbled under his breath. It was extremely quiet. But the mic pinned to his chest, picked it up. "Is he talking to himself?" Morgan asked, one of her eyebrows rising slightly. "Probably. Or he's trying to convince himself he's not in the wrong." Miller answered. The video cut to Reed, dropping the ID card. The plastic card slid from his hand and landed on Liam's chest. Liam fumbled his hands around his waist, bending his knees slightly to keep the card from falling to the ground. Reed just stood there, his thumbs hooked in his leather belt, and watched Liam struggle for nearly 10 breaths without making a single move to help. "I already told you the address," Liam's voice said in the video. Thick and hoarse. "You just write it down exactly like that. I'm not changing my statement." Reed's voice on the video became evasive. "I don't need you to tell me how to write a report. You heard me. I'm verifying. This address, it could be a virtual office. You know what a virtual office is. I'm the one here who decides what goes into the record." Morgan turned off the monitor. The room returned to the soft whir of the computer's fan. Reed entered the ID number wrong into the patrol car's computer later. Miller said, pushing a data printout toward Morgan. He left off the last digit. The system kicked back an error. He didn't fix it. He just closed the tab and wrote in the paper report. System verification slow. Morgan stood up and walked over to the window. She looked down at the station parking lot, where the patrol cars were lined up in perfect rows. This delay wasn't from a machine. This was human. Reed had 3 chances to stop. When he saw the symbol on the card, when he heard the radio confirmation, and when Liam stated his address, and each time, he chose to escalate just to maintain the upper hand. Miller closed the laptop. The video has 15 million views online. They don't need to see our file. All they need to see is him stepping on the man's cane. "Get Reed in here," Morgan said, her voice flat. "Don't let him see the video beforehand. Let him tell his side of the story one more time. I want to see how many times he changes his wording." Miller nodded, got up, and walked to the door. The sound of his heels on the wooden hallway floor was slow and steady, like the tapping rhythm of the white cane on the Central Avenue sidewalk the afternoon before. Reed pushed open the glass door of the police station. A blast of cold air from the central AC hit him in the face, drying the thin layer of sweat on his forehead. Reed didn't walk straight in. He stopped at the front desk, where a young officer, Martinez, was staring at his computer screen, twisting a bent paperclip in his hand. "It's Reed. Lieutenant Miller called me in," Reed said. He raised a hand, smoothed the fabric on his shoulder, then lowered it to adjust the handcuff case on his belt behind him. Martinez didn't look up right away. He typed a few keys, his eyes still fixed on a message in the corner of his screen. "Hang on. Travis. Just finishing up this report about a lost cat in Sector 5. Martinez paused and looked at the duty roster. "Miller. Room 2B. He's waiting. Oh. Hey. That case You handled yesterday. The guy's name was Leon something. Right. Liam. Liam Miller. Reed answered. He tapped his fingertips on the particle board countertop. I put Leon. Oh well. It's not like anyone's going to check the name in the desk log. Martinez said, his eyes already back on the screen. He scratched the back of his neck, then went back to twisting the paperclip. Reed walked down the hallway. The sound of his heels on the tile floor seemed louder than usual. He passed the water fountain and stopped, bending over to take a sip. The water was ice cold. Reed stood up straight, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked at the wall clock. He watched the second hand sweep halfway around the face. But when he turned away, he couldn't have told you what time it was. Reed stopped in front of room 2B. He pulled a pack of gum from his pocket, started to peel a stick, but then changed his mind and stuffed the pack back into his pants. Reed took a deep breath and opened the door. Lieutenant Miller was sitting there. There was nothing on the table but a thin file and a silver voice recorder. Miller didn't look up. He was busy flipping through the pages, his index finger rubbing hard against the edge of the paper, making a soft scratching sound. Sit down. Read, Miller said. Still, turning pages. Reed pulled out a chair. The legs made a screeching sound as they scraped against the floor. Reed sat down, his back a little too straight. He placed both hands on his thighs, then lifted his right hand to fiddle with his tie clip, even though it wasn't crooked. About the incident on Central Avenue yesterday, Miller began. He finally looked up, his eyes focusing on the mole on Reed's chin instead of looking him in the eye. I've read your report. You wrote that the subject was exhibiting suspicious behavior. That's right. He was holding a long object, refused to drop it when ordered. Reed said. His voice was a little higher than usual. At the time, given the context, I couldn't. Did you see the ID card? Miller cut him off. He reached for his iced coffee, which had melted into a watery brown liquid. Reed froze for a second. He raised a hand and rubbed the old scar on his chin. I saw it. But you know, with those numbers, sometimes the system wasn't wrong. Miller interrupted again. He pushed the data printout across the table toward Reed. You entered the number wrong. You typed a 0 instead of an 8 for the last digit. You heard the radio dispatch say, visually impaired. Category 1. But in your report, you wrote, health condition unknown. Why? Reed stared at the paper. He started to reach for it, then pulled his hand back. Reed glanced at the voice recorder on the table, its red light blinking. It was loud out there. The crowd was yelling. I could have misheard part of it. Besides, that guy, Miller, he was just standing there in a really strange way. He wasn't acting like a normal blind person. What's a normal blind person supposed to act like? Miller asked. He didn't wait for an answer, just looked down and underlined a line in the file. Well, they're supposed to act like they need help. Reed stammered. He just kept repeating his address, repeating his ID number like he was challenging me. I thought he was trying to create a situation to just answer what I'm asking. Miller cut in, his voice flat. I don't need you to psychoanalyze the subject. I need to know why you forced him up against the wall after you heard the radio confirmation. Reed fell silent. He looked down and began meticulously brushing a piece of non-existent lint from his uniform pants. He brushed from the knee down to his ankle, then brushed his way back up again. I wanted to ensure the safety of everyone in the area. That is within my authority. In the corner of the room, a backup officer stood leaning against a filing cabinet. He'd just been looking at his shoes, occasionally reaching up to adjust his collar. He looked like he was about to say something. His lips moved slightly. But then he turned to look at the landscape painting on the wall. Do you know that the video of the cane being stepped on was sent to the mayor's office? Miller asked, his hand starting to tap the tip of his ballpoint pen on the desk again. Where is that cane now? I let him take it. Reed answered. At the time, I didn't think we needed to keep it as evidence. Didn't you just say it was a potential weapon? Miller looked up, this time looking Reed straight in the eye. Reed didn't answer. He reached up again to adjust his leather belt. The metallic clink of his holster and keyring echoed in the small room. Reed looked down at the recorder, its red light blinking steadily like an artificial heartbeat. 11 o'clock at night. The duty office was empty. The rows of fluorescent lights above Martinez hummed with a thin, steady drone. He sat in front of a computer screen, the blue light glinting off his glasses. Martinez reached for the cold cup of instant noodles on the corner of his desk, was about to take a slurp, but then put it back down. Martinez looked at the name Leon Miller, which he'd mistyped into the duty roster that morning. His index finger rested on the backspace key. He tapped it lightly, deleting each letter, one by one. N, O, E, L. Then, he typed it again. L, I, A, M. Martinez paused. He didn't hit enter right away. He glanced toward the row of interview rooms, where Reed had walked out with a grim face 2 hours ago. Martinez raised a hand to scratch his head, then rubbed his aching neck. He knew that correcting the roster now meant admitting the system had been right from the start, and that the error was human. Next to the monitor, a phone was replaying the video from social media on mute. Martinez saw the back of Reed's uniform in the clip. He remembered the look on Reed's face when he'd walked past the duty desk earlier. Reed hadn't looked at anyone, his hand gripping his belt, his walk faster than usual. Martinez swallowed. He moved the mouse over to the system log. There. The login history for patrol car 412 was laid out plain as day. 8 lines of red error messages. Reed had deliberately entered the wrong ID for Liam Miller 8 times, each attempt about 30 seconds apart. Martinez reached up to adjust his collar. He felt like the air conditioner in the room had suddenly gotten stronger. He could choose clear, temporary log, the way some guys did to clean up a record for a colleague. Martinez picked up his car keys from the desk, thinking about standing up and going home. His shift had ended 10 minutes ago, but he was still sitting there. Martinez looked at Liam's ID number. He opened a new tab. Accessed the state database. He typed in the name Liam Miller. A photo appeared. A man in sunglasses, short hair, his face expressionless. Below the photo was a line of text. Holder of visually impaired assistance ID. Martinez stood up and walked over to the printer in the corner. He didn't run straight to the chief's office. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets. He stopped in front of the printer, looking at the blank sheet of paper waiting there. Martinez went back to his computer and hit print for the system log of car 412. The whirring of the printer cut through the office's silence. Martinez picked up the still warm paper, folded it into quarters, and tucked it into his uniform pocket. He walked toward Lieutenant Miller's office on the 2nd floor. When he got to the door, Martinez didn't knock right away. He looked through the slightly ajar door and saw Miller, head down, writing something under the solitary light of a desk lamp. Martinez raised his hand to knock, but then pulled it back. He stood in the hallway for about 2 minutes, his hand clutching the paper in his pocket. Martinez, what is it? Miller's voice came from inside, hoarse from lack of sleep. Martinez walked in. He didn't say anything about justice or the truth. He just put the paper on the desk. The error codes for car 412. I saw it was hanging in the system, so I printed it out for you. The system wasn't slow. Reed entered the last digit wrong 8 times in a row. Miller picked up the paper. Read it over quickly. He looked at Martinez. You sure about this? Martinez looked down at his shoes. I just double-checked Miller's ID in the state database. Everything matches. I've corrected the name in the roster from Leon to Liam. I don't want the end-of-month report to get kicked back because of a wrong name on the subject. Martinez turned to leave. He didn't wait for Miller to thank him. When he reached the door, he paused for a beat. Hey, Lieutenant. His cane, It really does have a medical ID number under the handle. I saw it in the support team's scene photos. Martinez walked out of the police station. He took out his car keys, opened the door, and sat in the driver's seat. He didn't feel like he'd just done something heroic. He just felt the ache in his neck a little less. Martinez started the car and slowly pulled out of the parking lot, leaving behind the air-conditioned hallways that were about to be shaken up by a thin piece of paper. 7 in the morning. Travis Reed stood in front of the magnetic door leading to the precinct's locker room. He held his ID card up to the reader. The machine let out a long beep, a red light flashing instead of the usual green. Reed swiped it a second time. Then, a third. The door remained shut. "Hey, is this thing broken again?" Reed turned and asked Officer Henderson, who was walking up behind him. Henderson didn't stop. He swiped his own card, and the door opened with a clean click. Henderson walked through, holding the door but looking straight ahead at the row of filing cabinets in the distance. "Your ID's been suspended. Travis, go see Miller on the 2nd floor." "Suspended? What do you mean?" "My shift starts at 8, Reed said, his voice going up a notch. He followed Henderson inside, his hand reaching up to fix the collar of his not-yet-ironed uniform. Henderson didn't answer. He opened his locker and started to unbuckle his leather belt without turning around. Reed stood in the middle of the aisle, hands on his hips, his eyes scanning the electronic duty roster on the wall. On the line for Patrol Car 412, the name Travis Reed was gone. In its place was a gray box with the words, "Awaiting assignment." Reed walked quickly up the stairs. The sound of his heels hitting the wooden floor was hurried, losing its usual steady rhythm. In front of Lieutenant Miller's office, Reed saw Thompson, the police union rep, leaning against the wall, holding a thick file, his eyes on the floor. "Thompson, what are you doing here so early?" Reed asked, raising a hand to smooth his short-cropped hair. Thompson looked up, stared at the scar on Reed's chin for about 3 seconds, then looked back down. "I'm here to make sure you don't say anything more stupid than what you've already done." "Travis." They walked into the room. Chief Morgan was sitting there, and in front of her was a small plastic tray. Inside the tray were the silver voice recorder and a sealed evidence tag. "Have a seat," Morgan said. She didn't look at Reed. She was using a small pen to check off a list of department property. Reed didn't sit right away. He leaned against the edge of the desk, fiddling with the flap on his shirt pocket. "I was trying to log into the system to finish up that Miller report, but my ID wouldn't work. Is there some kind of technical issue?" "There's no issue." Morgan looked up. "Your access was revoked as of midnight last night. All the data from your bodycam has been sealed for a federal investigation. You no longer have the right to touch a single line of that file." Reed licked his lips. He glanced at Thompson, but Thompson was staring intently at the zipper on his briefcase. "Look, I was just following procedure. That downtown area. You guys know what it's like. All sorts of people carrying strange objects around. I have to ensure safety." "Right." I checked his ID. And yeah, there was a little mix-up with the number. But that was a system lag. The system doesn't lag 8 times in a row. "Travis," Morgan cut in. Her voice was flat, without a ripple of emotion. She pushed the plastic tray toward Reed. "Put your ID card, badge, and the keys to car 412 in here." Reed stood frozen. His shoulders slumped a little. He raised his hand to unpin his badge, but his fingers were trembling slightly, fumbling with the metal clasp behind the fabric. "You're all blowing this up over some video on the internet. I've served here for 8 years. 8 years. You served for 8 years only to step on a citizen's medical device when you knew full well they were blind," Morgan said. She pushed the termination papers toward Reed. "This isn't about the video. This is about the false report you signed your name to this morning. You wrote that his health status was unknown when the radio dispatch clearly stated he was a Category 1 visually impaired individual. That is falsifying a public record." "Thompson," who had been silent, finally spoke. His voice clipped. "Sign it. Travis, I've seen the system logs from Martinez. There's no way to explain away entering the wrong ID 8 times. You did this to yourself." Reed looked at the paper. He didn't pick up the pen right away. He looked out the window, where the patrol cars were starting to leave the station for the morning shift. He saw Martinez standing in the yard, holding a stack of papers, looking toward the second-floor office. Martinez didn't wave, didn't turn away, just stood there like a silent landmark. Reed picked up the pen. He signed his name, his handwriting shaky and messy. Then, he placed his plastic ID card on the tray. The sound of the plastic hitting the aluminum tray made a dry, hollow click, ending 8 years of walking the beat on Central Avenue. "Can I get my personal belongings?" Reed asked. "Henderson's already put everything in a cardboard box." Morgan replied, her eyes already back on another file. "It's waiting for you at the back gate. You should go that way. There are reporters at the front entrance." Reed stood up. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. As he walked out of the room, he saw his shadow stretch long down the empty hallway. His login credentials were dead. His authority had been wiped from the lines of code. Travis Reed walked away, no longer with the creak of a leather holster, just the lonely sound of his own footsteps on the cold tile floor. 4 months after that afternoon on Central Avenue, Liam Miller sat at his usual table at the Copper Star coffee shop. At his feet was a new white cane, its aluminum shaft perfectly straight, the red reflective tape unscratched. The old cane, the one with the dent from the boot heel, was now in the back of a closet in apartment 4B. He didn't throw it away, but he never touched it anymore. Chloe placed a black coffee, no sugar, no cream, on the table. She paused for a beat, glancing at the new cane, then up at Liam. "That one looks shinier today," she said, wiping the table lightly with a grey cloth. Liam reached for the handle of the mug. "Thanks, Chloe. It's the same as the last one." The incident didn't have a dramatic ending. It ended with lines of code in a banking system and papers with red seals. A week ago, Liam's lawyer confirmed that the $180,000 settlement from the City of Phoenix's insurance fund had been transferred into a trust account. The number, 180,000, appeared on Liam's screen reader in a dry, emotionless, synthesized voice. As part of the settlement, the city was required to implement 12 hours of mandatory training on identifying medical assistance devices for all active duty officers. A new protocol was signed, requiring that any interaction with a person carrying a white cane be audio recorded and reported directly to an independent oversight department. Liam used part of the money to pay his lawyer's fees and made a donation to the state's Guide Dog Training Fund. To him, the money felt like a fee paid for the 8 minutes he spent with his face pressed against a rough brick wall. It had the weight of paperwork, but it didn't have the taste of perfect justice. At the Phoenix Police Department, the file bearing Travis Reed's name was sealed and moved to an electronic archive with the label, "Ineligible for rehire." Reed's law enforcement certification number in the state of Arizona was officially revoked. Reed's access to all public service buildings was permanently locked. Reed was now sitting in a security guard booth at a logistics warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He wore a plain, ash-gray uniform with no metal badges. Reed sat there, holding a local paper, his eyes occasionally flicking to a monitor displaying 16 black and white feeds. His income was now less than a third of what it was back at Precinct 412. Reed no longer adjusted his leather belt once a minute. He sat still, chewed on a piece of dry bread, and avoided looking at the camera mounted in the corner of the booth's ceiling. The statement from the woman at the flower shop arrived at the prosecutor's office 3 weeks late. In it, she wrote simply, "I saw, but I was afraid. I am sorry for this delay." That statement was clipped to the final page of the case file, leaving a blue ink smudge on the thick stack of documents. The police academy used the footage from Reed's bodycam as required curriculum for new recruits. The clip was edited down, showing only the moment Reed looked at the ID card with the visual impairment code and still ordered the man against the wall. The instructor didn't call Reed a bad guy. He just said, "This is an example of ignoring visible data to protect a faulty assumption. Do not repeat it." Liam Miller stood up. He put on his sunglasses, took his white cane, and folded it neatly into 4 sections. He walked like a man who needed to get home to finish a line of code for a new software project. The click-clack of the aluminum cane echoed as he unfolded it at the coffee shop door. The rhythm was still slow, steady, and sure. Central Avenue was still hot. Patrol cars still drove by. But now, when they saw a white cane sweeping across the sidewalk, the officers behind the wheel kept more distance than necessary. The system didn't change completely, but it had saved a record that couldn't be deleted. Justice in real life usually isn't pretty. It's the color of invoices, dry reports, and cold administrative decisions. Officer Reed didn't have a breakdown. He was just pushed out of the system he once abused. Liam Miller didn't become a hero. He just got back the right to go for coffee without having a gun drawn on him. The truth is sometimes just about things going back to their proper place, even if that place has taken on a different shape. If you find value in these real stories, raw but true, leave your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the other hidden corners we'll bring to light. Thank you for tuning in to Black Tales Exposed.